Welcome, everyone. Hope you guys are having a nice Sunday evening or possibly Monday morning, depending on where you are. I am back with my good friend, longtime social media comrade, Sal from 2 Cents Toys. And we heard you all loud and clear. You guys wanted to discuss this some more. And Sal and I are happy to oblige you. So we are here tonight. And what we decided to do, and Sal, you keep me honest on this. What we decided to do was we're going to do a leapfrog kind of method where we're going to talk about, on one episode, we'll talk about a few more obscure esoteric things. And then maybe on the next episode, we'll talk about something that everybody's kind of familiar with, but maybe don't know the nuances of the conversation. So first of all, before we get started, Sal, how are you?
Her what? Very good, very good. I'm not allowed to smoke in my apartment, so the pipe is empty. However, I may imbibe after the stream is over. Quite palatable.
So, okay, so smoking's out in the apartment. Do you vape?
I do.
Mm-hmm.
I do.
Is vaping allowed?
Until you get caught.
All right. Well, tonight we are talking about two areas of interest, everyone, that you may or may not have heard of. I'm going to let Sal introduce the first topic, and then I will have a discussion with Sal about that. And then, of course, we'll move on to the second topic. But they're both kind of related. The overview of the two topics of discussion in the title tonight. I can never pronounce the first one. Sal, can you help me with that?
I believe it's Ggantija.
Ggantija, right.
Which it loosely translates to like Temple of Giant or the Giant's Temple.
Right. And then the second one, of course, is the Osireion, which a lot of people who only have a casual knowledge of Egypt and Egypt iconography, might not be aware of it. But it is a really important, it's a really important architectural construct and point of contention between traditional Egyptologists and people who have been connecting the dots in a different way. So let's start with Ggantija. I can't do it. I can't figure. My brain will not wrap around this word because it's
Ggantija.
Ggantija.
Yeah, it's difficult because it has two G's, and the first G has an accent mark, and I'm not familiar with. Like I'm used to umlauts and things like that. This is just a circle above it, right. So it's new to me. It's worth mentioning on the previous episode, I incorrectly said Maldives when I meant Malta. So this is the one I was referring to, but I said Maldives, which is in South Asia. For some reason, Maldives popped in my head, not Malta. This is the one I was talking about.
Okay.
So if anyone was confused, it was this one.
Gotcha.
So Malta, for those that don't know, it's off either the eastern or the southern coast of Sicily. So it's in the Mediterranean. And this particular site is if you were going by it, like if you didn't know what it would just look like a pile of rocks.
I have a picture of it right here. Yeah. Right there.
Yeah, it's quite sizable. So on the other side of those, I guess, berms, for lack of a better word, it's mostly just other rocks and greenery. So also, it doesn't quite do it justice because it's absolutely massive.
Oh, okay. Well, I can find another image of it.
Well, it's difficult, like, because there's seldom ever a person in the photo for scale.
Right.
So you look at it, you're like, oh, that kind of just looks like where you'd store firewood or something, but it's huge.
Yeah, it kind of has it's a large complex. Let me save this image here and then bring it into our show.
Yes, and it's not too dissimilar from Göbekli Tepe. There we go. See, you can see two little black dots there on the left. Those are people. That lets you know just how big this thing is.
Yeah.
It was found in Malta, and there are people who disagree about the time frame. They say that the people who came to Malta were there when the land bridge formed. Some people say that they've only been there dated, I think, like 7,000 years or something. But there are people who have done, archaeological digs and all that, and kind of determined this is about the same age as Göbekli Tepe. It's about 10,000 years old.
Right.
But it's called the Giant's Fort because the mythology surrounding it primarily involves a giantess whose name I don't remember off the top of my head. Not that I'd be able to pronounce it if I did. But so supposedly she built this by herself, picking up the rocks and all that, and had picked a local man to sire a child with. So anytime you see her, she's like a kind of she kind of looks like a babushka a little bit in sculpture form. She just looks like a very nondescript older woman wearing like a dress, but always carrying a child on her back. So the site's been linked to fertility rites or fertility ceremonies, things like that, and supposedly she's buried there. But the thing that really kind of sucks about the site in particular, I don't remember the time frame, but parts of it were deconstructed to build other things.
Right, which happens a lot with ancient structures, is that they end up having a lot of their structure cannibalized. I mean, that even happened to the Great Pyramid. All the facing stones got shaken loose during a major earthquake in like the 9th century or something. And
before they had the foresight, at least before they did that, someone sat down and kind of sketched everything. So it's quote unquote it's being reconstructed or has been reconstructed to look like it did. So I feel like that may throw some of the dating off. Like if someone found a much newer rock and put it there, or whatever the case may be, I just feel like it's like tampering with a crime scene. Like evidence has been tainted, unfortunately. But yeah, it's a very kind of nondescript area, and I think they found one. There's another site in Malta that I think begins with a P that I can't remember, but there's a very similar site either on the southern or northern part of Malta. It's cat a corner from it.
Right.
Very, very similar. I think it's like Propoya, something like that. I don't speak whatever they speak, because I'm a man of culture and a well-traveled man. But yeah, it's just kind of, it's not. It's interesting in that it exists, but it's not one of the ones that just kind of grabs at you. Like it doesn't have the same mystery, because it just, as horrible as it is to say, it looks like a pile of rocks. So it's kind of like anyone could do this. You just stack the rocks and it looks fine. Right.
There's a whole episode of Graham Hancock's new Netflix show, Ancient Apocalypse, that deals with this site. Yep. And I watched it today to prep for the show, and he talks about how the real timeline challenge of this is that traditional archaeology, the mainstream establishment, says that there wasn't human activity before a certain time on Malta. Unfortunately, these particular constructs are so advanced that it calls into question for anybody with eyes and common sense. Okay, how would a hunter-gatherer society that just wandered here on wooden rafts, no less? The mainstream says, oh, they brought some animals on wooden rafts over and they stayed on this island and they just kind of started a society. Right. And it's like, well, first of all, this island used to be connected to the European mainland in the Ice Age. Like it used to be connected, and they know for a fact that that's how indigenous animals got on the island. So why wouldn't it stand to reason that why wouldn't there have been humans that crossed that land bridge, just like they did from Siberia to what's now Alaska, Canada?
Right. And the funny thing is the disconnect, I think, is they don't really think about why humans migrate.
Right.
Because humans hunt animals, animals run away from humans, humans migrate to hunt more animals. So it's
right.
Why would they bring animals with them on a wooden boat to an island? What do they stand to gain from that?
Sorry, go ahead.
They stand to gain nothing. If they're a hunter-gatherer, they stand to gain nothing by going to an unknown location where they don't know if animals are there. So they're hunter-gatherer, but they have domesticated animals that they bring with them.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating.
Yeah. It's, to me, it gets back to the thing that John Anthony West and Graham Hancock and a lot of other guys have talked about, which is, he made it very clear, and even the episode he just did, about this, that this isn't about, he says it out loud. He's like, I'm not saying that it wasn't these people or these people that built the thing. What I'm saying is, how did these people build this thing without advanced technology? In other words, like, if the timeline is hunter-gatherer, and suddenly we know how to farm, which is very strange, which he calls into question. You don't just go from hunter-gatherer to raising thousands of massive megaliths to build intricate temples that line up with the star of Sirius on certain solstices, amazing knowledge of the stars and everything else, out of nothing. Like, and that's where I think people start to get real, they start to get real emotionally combative, because they're only hearing half of what's being said, and they're not hearing the other half. They think that what's being said is, your people couldn't have done this. And it's like, that's literally not what was said. What was said is, people did this, but we're not arguing over when it was done. And we're arguing over your assertion that there was no technology or know-how to do this prior to a certain time in human history. And as Graham Hancock often points out, the linear timeline of progression never takes into account that humans as a species have been on this planet a lot longer than the 10,000 years it takes to form a technological society. So, civilizations rise and fall and all this kind of stuff. They're not really.
An example is the Romans in Britain. They were considered a myth for a long time. Like, it was just this chunk of history that no one knew about. And then all the baths were found and everything. Like, oh, the Romans were here.
Oh, crikey, Romans were here. I can't believe it.
Hadrian's Wall, another example. So
King Eric the Greatest, thank you for the super chat. He says, for those about to stack rocks, we salute you. Well, Shadowcaster, Graham Hancock does question the pyramids in South America a lot. And again, what it boils down to is, he's not trying to take credit away from the people who were there. He says that the people who were there were the ones who built them, but they had to build them with knowledge that has been lost to us. That's the thing. And a lot of people seem to interpret that as, because Graham Hancock believes in an antediluvian society, he doesn't think that it's like, no, the indigenous peoples of those areas built those things with knowledge that has been lost. It wasn't like aliens. It wasn't like, so
I can put my hair up like that next time.
Aliens. So he talks about, if you read his book, Shadowcaster, Fingerprints of the Gods, and then he has a new book called Magicians of the Gods. And also, if you watch the Ancient Apocalypse show, where he does extensive looks into Central and South American ruins and temple structures, temple complexes, he talks about their precise layouts and their incredible megalithic construction and everything like that. The other thing that I thought was interesting with this site that you chose to bring up tonight, Sal, was that it's one of the few times where I've seen them bring up the, I don't want to say, it's not evidence, it's physically there. It's not a theory. They're all there, but they kept building more and more of these temples as over the centuries, as the stars kept moving in the sky, because they kept wanting to line up with Sirius. And of course, the mainstream archaeological world wants to say that, well, no, they just built these because. And it's like, well, who would go to this kind of effort over and over and over and over and over and over again to keep building and rebuilding and not rebuilding, but building new ones over and over,
right,
with slightly different orientations if they've already got the one finished, like, and when you start backing everything up past the window that they claim that these temples were built in, you get to a period where you go, oh, the one star in the sky that aligns with all of these over a certain interval is Sirius. The other thing that I found interesting about this was the way that they were dating the complexes was the same flawed way that they dated the temple complex at Giza, where, oh, we found some stuff that is from X dynasty or X century, therefore these must be from that time.
Right.
And it's like, well, that doesn't often work that way. Like,
right.
if I was, sorry, go ahead, Sal.
There's a quote I was going to bring up during the Osireion, but there's a quote from Bill Maher, of all people, on an unrelated topic. But he says it's a lot easier to change the sign out front and say under new management.
Yes.
So
yeah,
they're like, oh, we found carvings from this thing, so it's this. It's like, or those were added later because it's easier to say, So it's like I could write, I don't know, Kilroy was here on my desk, and people are like, oh, it's like, yeah, but I've had this desk for 4 years, so.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, I could normally there's something antique-y within reach in my house, but oddly not today. But like I could, for example, they talk about how pharaohs, they were, and we're talking about this with the Osireion as well, because it's going to come up again. Pharaohs did restoration projects of their own on older complexes and temples and everything like that, and then they would leave their mark. So like, for example, the Sphinx literally had an inventory stela in between its paws that says on it, that's still there and says on it, this restoration was carried out in the year so and so by Pharaoh blah 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 of the Sphinx, which is of a vastly old age and blah 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 blah. Like they literally left receipts for their restoration work on things that preceded them. So to then turn around and say, like in this case, well, we found some things from, I don't know what it was. It was like, I'm pulling dates out of here, but it's like if we say, oh, well, this was made in the year 4000 BC because we found something from the year 4000 BC. It's like, well, but if in the year 4000 BC you also claim that there wasn't anybody around to build things like this, shouldn't we suppose that this is just older and a lot of people were like, ooh, that's convenient to have around, let's go build a shelter there.
Right.
Like,
if I'm out in the wilderness and I find a cave, I'm not going to be like, you know what, no, I'm going to make a lean-to,
right? Yeah,
I'm going to use the cave. So
the Hancock loves to talk about how it's like, you're going to tell me that people who could build this were surrounding it with mud hut villages. You're going to tell me that, which I always find funny.
Yeah. You're going to tell me that Gordon Ramsay makes a grilled cheese sandwich with a panini maker.
Yeah. Yeah, essentially. Yeah. Between sites like this and Göbekli Tepe, is that how it's
Göbekli Tepe? Or could also be Göbekli Tepe.
Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah.
Between sites like this and that starting to surface, do you have any hope that, I mean, because I don't want to discount, I when there's a big question mark, there's a question mark.
Right.
I'm not trying to say, oh, this answer is right and this one's wrong. But what I am trying to say is, if there's still a question mark, then you need to run it to ground until you can say eliminate one or the other. These sites are finally calling into question the orthodoxy of mainstream archaeology.
Right.
And yet, right now, they're staunchly sticking to their talking points, their script. Do you have any confidence that in our lifetime the establishment will start to break ranks?
No.
Really?
My faith in humanity at its current moment is somewhere between 0 and less than. Um, Only because I feel like it'll take people like Graham Hancock to like kind of, I hate to use an old meme like the bird box, but to like hold their eyes open and make them look at it.
Right.
It's one of those like, I liken it to music theory, which there's another music metaphor I'll use here in a second, where music theory only works if you accept certain things as true.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you base, the music theory in college 1 through 4 or 101, 102, whatever scaling you use. It only works if you understand certain things fundamentally as non-debatable.
Uh-huh.
So for someone like me, I really struggled my first semester. They're like, oh, this, I'm like, but why?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it just is. Because.
Uh-huh.
And they're like, it just is. And I'm like, oh, okay. Like that,
Yeah.
you can break down like sound frequencies and all that, and that's what gives us certain tones between certain tones. Like, but that's not what theory is. That's more engineering.
Right.
But it's kind of the same thing. Like in their world, they can only plot out the world map and world history if certain things remain true.
Mm-hmm.
And so to do that calls into question everything else that's established. So for them, it might just be easier to put their head in the sand and kind of just ignore everything, so that way their worldview doesn't change. Kind of like, I don't know, if you hold, kind of like a kid believing in Santa Claus. Like they just really, like you get to that age when you start to question it a little bit. And
right.
It's watching Santa Claus is 100% real. Don't let anyone ever lie to you. Now block your ears and don't listen to what I'm about to say.
Right.
So you get to that age when you start to question it, and you're like, you kind of hold on to it a little bit, but then it just takes one person to be like, yeah, that's your parents, dude. And then, so it kind of shatters your worldview a little bit. Which really Santa Claus is just all adults collectively lying to children, which,
right.
That's America's favorite pastime. But speaking about, we talked about, they go hunter-gatherer, then all of a sudden they're building things like that, just all of a sudden overnight. Similarly, with things like the Baroque period or the classical period or, the Romantics, things like that, we have these like hard set dates from this time to this time, but it's more of a transitory period. Like it starts here, but the style of music was still being done until about here, and kind of like watching, people talk about the best decade ever. Like, the 70s are the best, or the 80s are the best, 90s are the best, whatever. There's a transitory period. So the 80s bleed over into the 90s by about 3 years. I only consider really like from any decade, like really like 4, 5, 6, maybe 7.
Yep.
To be that actual decade. Otherwise, it's dovetailed on either end from the start and the end of the other decades.
Right.
So that being said, that's kind of a big jump. Like to go from hunting squirrel and deer to building megaliths.
Yep.
And who built the megaliths? Because if you're building a megalith, you're not eating.
It was the working theory behind what happened to the people of Easter Island. That they built so many of these megaliths that they literally stripped their island of any food sources or trees that produced any. They literally destroyed everything to make these megaliths and these statues, and then they had nothing left to sustain themselves. And now we've discovered, I believe, unless it was a hoax, I can't trust photos anymore on the internet. I don't know, but is it true now they've discovered that the Easter Island statues also have full bodies underneath them?
I've heard that a few times. There was some cartoon I was watching as a kid where that happened. Like it was played for jokes that there was a body underneath of it, and that was the first time I'd heard of it. And then I remember it being a big deal when I was in, I think, high school, roughly. They're like, oh, they found bodies under there. But I keep hearing about it like every couple of years that they found bodies. And I'm like, is this a recurring hoax that people just keep breathing life back into? Or is this just like an old article they could share? Like every once in a while, someone will share an article about Gene Wilder being dead.
Right.
I'm like, he died years ago. Why is this news? And they're like, oh, I'm like, did you not see the date on the article? And they're like, I thought he just died. So
yeah.
it could be that.
It was brought up in Forbes. So I guess if it's Forbes magazine, they're a little more careful.
Right.
They're not careful with their movie reviews, but they're really careful with other stuff. So maybe
a little more reputable than like idigholes.com or something.
Yeah. I love that one. There's this one site that keeps coming up in my newsfeed all the time. Now it's called The Archaeologist. And I'm like, oh, great. So you grabbed what sounds like a really reputable name, but the articles I read from you guys are like clickbait city. Like it's not, it's like every time you read movie news from The Direct. It's just like, ugh.
The Inquirer.
Yeah.
Or I think it's The Sun if you're in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, The Sun. Yeah. Page 3 is nice though on The Sun. Let's see. So I had a question here, or maybe it was a comment here. Tim Hayes says, nice hat, RetroBlasting. Just a real quick little bit of info on that. So this hat, I had to have it made back in 2005 or 6. I was trying to get a hat made that would replicate Stuart Granger's hat from the 1950 version of King Solomon's Mines, which I have a reference photo that I grabbed here for you. So there's a more weathered version of it. My hat hasn't really been taken on any safaris yet, but that's the hat that I was trying to model my request off of. And a really great hatter named Art Fawcett took up the challenge and made the hat.
No, that is a shirt with some epaulets on it.
That's right. I love the rifle bullets in the up there too. Yeah,
those aren't going to fall out at all.
Yeah.
I like to think he put him in there and he's like, those ain't going anywhere.
Yeah, it's like, oh no, they're going somewhere. Not in the gun. So there was something else I was going to bring up, and now I can't remember for the life of me what it was about what we were talking about. Crap. It'll come back to me. So yeah, these establishment archaeologists, they, as we were talking about, they like to find something convenient and then attribute the whole site to that person. Although, as Graham Hancock pointed out amusingly in his book Fingerprints of the Gods, there are 19th, 17th, and 18th century graffiti in the upper corbels of the pyramids from like, French or German boxers or something like that, like heavyweight, fighter guys who showed up. I think it was an Italian guy, something like that. And, they literally painted their names in there, like I was here, all that kind of stuff. And
that's part of the reason why you can't, if you go to Stonehenge, you can't go more than like 100 feet from it.
Right. Yeah.
Because people would take out little hammers and they'd like chip off little rocks to take home because tourists are a disease.
Yeah. And that was why they had to start putting people farther and farther away. Yeah. Because early on, back before people, like you were talking about with the British thinking the Romans were a myth, there for a long time, people had forgotten exactly why Stonehenge had been built there and what it was. They just knew it was these rocks on this hill, and you could just walk right up to them. I mean, I'm talking like 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. And then in the 19th century, when they started really doing some excavation there, and then into the 20th, people got real curious and really wanted to all show up. And that's when they started damaging the site. I remember when they did, it was Matt Smith's era of Doctor Who. The BBC had to jump through some major hoops during one episode to get permission to film inside the circle. And there were all these restrictions and everything like that, and they had to follow it to the letter or whatever. But Matt Smith talked about what a crazy experience that was, to be one of the few British people that was suddenly allowed to be inside the Stonehenge circle, which is pretty cool.
Right. I have it on good authority, though. I have been there, but I believe it's a fake because the real Stonehenge, I think, is only about 11 inches tall, I think. There's a crew called Spinal Tap who established that, corrected it for all of us historians.
Yes, and we're in their debt. We really are in their debt. Now, this is what I wanted to say, and I forgot it for a second, but it's come back to me. Before we continue our conversation, based on how mainstream archaeology conducts itself, shouldn't there be some kind of like mandate that all archaeologists then should be atheists? Because they don't really have a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? They don't exhibit creative thinking. They don't exhibit a kind of, so if they're going to be pedantic about this timeline, I'm going to have to call into question their views on their own spiritual background as well. And I'm not trying to blow this out of the water here and take us down a rabbit hole. I'm simply pointing out that, you know what I'm saying? Like if you, if you're going to believe whatever you believe, and religions are about faith over evidence, right? So if you're going to have faith over evidence in this corner of your life to an extreme, like to the point of, I believe that this is a creator of the planet, whatever. But then over here, you're going to go, no, there's no way this structure could have existed before these people here in our master timeline. And I'm just going to call that, I'm going to be like, wait a second. Because I'm not saying that what Graham Hancock is saying is taken on faith. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is his conjectures and his posits are far more reasonably arrived at than even the commonly accepted religious backgrounds of this planet. So
it reminds me of the phrase begs the question, which a lot of people think like, oh, this begs the question. It's like, no, the begs the question is where you have the result and you're wanting the question.
Right.
So it feels like that might play into it. It's hard because we see it in other facets of our collector community, where it's hard to defend against bias. So it's, there's people like obvious bias, and there's ones where it's like it's implied, even if it's not there, just by nature of connection. So it's kind of like if you have this innate, like the world is this old, or whatever, or you have this happened due to what I believe, it's going to be harder for you to accept this as, what was it, even in it wasn't the 1800s, it was after the 1800s, possibly during the Bone Wars, after the Bone Wars, where people were starting to say, well, the devil put the dinosaur bones there to deceive us.
Right.
So it's, I'm not saying that all archaeologists are like that, but it's
sorry, I'm having to address this. That's not what I'm saying, Malekith. That's not what I'm saying. I do not want government to have religious discrimination for particular fields. What I'm saying is the type of thinking that would take an archaeologist to be pedantic to the point of shutting down certain areas of thought, one would think that they also then would have a hard time being religious.
Right.
I'm not saying that, like, I'm not trying to imply that there should be a mandate or a regulation. I'm saying that the type of people who would think this way in one area, you would think would then think this way in another area. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah. There would be bleed over.
Yeah.
Which, I'm sure there are plenty of people who are able to separate the two worlds.
Right.
I don't know that many archaeologists in person.
Right.
You might assume. So it is, I'm assuming it's possible. Like I do my job and this is my hobby, which is completely unrelated.
Right.
But it's when you meet someone who is of super devout faith, a guy I used to work with, I think they're called apologists, where he had an answer or a spin for everything.
Right.
So it's like maybe not someone I'd want on a dig site.
I was funny. I was brought up in. My mom is Protestant. My dad is Catholic, and he was born in a split family as well, where his mother was Catholic and his father was Anglican, which is pretty close, but still. But the point is that I got put in a lot of Catholic schools, right? But I was also told by my mom especially to, study and ask questions and this and this and that.
Right.
She's very like in tune with her religion and all that kind of stuff. And I was the kid that was like, in these religion classes that I had in these Catholic schools, I would ask questions about elements because I grew up with Indiana
Jones to this day.
Yeah, right. So like, when I'm watching Indiana Jones and no, it's no problem, Malekith. It's no problem. As long as you give me opportunity to explain myself, we're all good. So you didn't go off and start calling me a crazy person or whatever. So we're cool.
Wouldn't be the first
time. So I would ask these questions sometimes. Like I really loved, and as we talked about in the last episode, I really got into a lot of this through the avenue of biblical archaeology, where I was looking at the Ark of the Covenant, things like that. So I would ask questions like, what could have ostensibly happened? And I'm bringing this up to make a point, guys. I'm not trying to derail the conversation into the Ark. We're going to get back on track in a second. But it's like, I want to find out like what possibly could have happened to the Ark after it disappeared from the Bible and why, and what are the different theories that are plausible? What are the different, and I was often met by people of authority, meaning in my schooling and stuff, who would look at me, and while they liked the fact that I was inquisitive, they would often follow that up with things like, why are you trying to disprove this? And it often happened too when I was trying to find historical records for a guy named Jesus. Like I was trying to see where he showed up in the historical record. And I kept looking back at them going, you're really taking my intent totally the wrong way. Like I'm excited about this stuff. I really get energized by this stuff. I want to know that there are amazing possibilities out there. I don't want to live in this 20th, at the time 20th, now 21st century. I don't want to live in this 21st century world where everything is blasé and everything is, cynical and everything is this. And while it is here in the present, it gives me more impetus to look back into a past and go, amazing things might have been happening back then if we just, take more time to look. And so it took me a while to get them to understand that I wasn't coming at them trying to disprove something. I was coming at them trying to follow the breadcrumbs to something that could be proven.
Right.
And yeah. So anyway, sorry for the rant.
No, it makes sense to me.
All right.
It's how do I describe it? Like what? So without going too far down that rabbit hole, still, I'm not what you would consider a religious person by any stretch. And one of my closest friends is a pastor. So we have discussions all the time, just not even debates, just trying to understand each other. And no harm, no foul. And I just feel like a lot of people nowadays just think that I can understand you and see your point of view. Doesn't mean I agree with you, but it doesn't mean I hate you either. Where a lot of people think like, if you can see my point of view and see where I'm coming from, why don't you agree with me?
Right.
And that's just this disconnect.
Yeah.
It's possible to understand and be like, okay, that makes sense for you, for me, it's different. Like my dad used to say, believe what you want to believe, but be willing to change your mind when you're presented with a fact.
Yes. Yes. Malekith says they want to mold you to what's the uniform consensus when all you're doing is having an intellectual exercise. You're walking the tightrope. You know, Malekith, that is a conundrum I find myself in often on this channel with things that aren't even this heavy. I find myself just doing intellectual exercises about the concept behind a toy line or whatever, and then people are like, "Rah, you're overthinking it." Well, that's what we do here, so get over it.
Right.
And then Logic Blaster says, religions tend to push back when we ask for evidence. Ark of the Covenant needs to be found in order to prove it is true. Word of mouth stories aren't enough, which is interesting because a lot of stories have their origins in truth.
Right. Yeah, we mentioned that in the previous episode where the best fiction is about 80% true, 20% fiction.
Yep. And it's funny that that this is dovetailing for us because into this because the whole idea of legends being true, like we talked about on the last episode, really surrounds everything regarding the Osireion.
Right.
Because I'll just pull up a photo of this real quick. Here is the Osireion in Abydos in Egypt, and it is a temple, obviously, and by most accounts, it could be one of the oldest, if not the oldest. What do you call it? Oldest architectural site. What's that?
Oh, structure.
Structure. Thank you. The oldest structure. I'm cutting off circulation to my brain with this hat, so I'm going to put this hat back and get back to the yeah, this hat still needs a little bit of training, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So for those looking at this photo, it's worth mentioning there's a wet and dry season in Egypt, and this is during the wet season when the Nile floods a little bit. During the dry season, there's like two kind of spots where the water doesn't recede all the way, but otherwise it's a mostly dry, flat bed at the bottom.
Yeah, it's and the blocks that you're seeing here are massive. They are,
I think they're calculated at 60 ton.
Yeah, like yeah, they're gargantuan. They make many of the blocks at the they rival many of the blocks at the pyramid site at Giza for mass, weight, and ton. Like the unwieldiness of these blocks is tremendous. So, you know, one of the things that Hancock and other alternative scholars point out is that they could have built temples out of masonry that served the same purpose and function with far less complicated means than how they constructed these. It becomes this kind of question of, you know, the path of least resistance versus immensely complicated kinds of things. So, for example, when you look at the mainstream, you want to say, if it was just a temple to worship whatever, they could have done that a lot more simply. Like there was, you know,
it's for the fellows out there listening, it's, you know, if your wife, the woman that you love, loves flowers, it's a difference between like, oh, lilies are her favorite flower, I'm gonna go get her some stargazer lilies from this florist, versus going into Walmart and grabbing the $5 bundle that's like dandelions or whatever.
Yeah.
So if she just likes flowers, okay, whatever. But if it's like, this is your wife, someone you love, so that the correlation being is that if this was just some schmucky temple, why go through that? Yeah, this is clearly important. So.
It is a temple that is attributed to, I believe, Seti the First. But let me confirm that. It is, yeah. Seti the First, who was the son of Ramses the Second. Ramses the Second was, of course, the pharaoh from Exodus, the Moses story. But the Osireion has a cartouche in it on one of the megaliths that's Seti the First cartouche, because his temple is actually adjacent to it.
Right.
But the weird part about it is that's the only thing that the Osireion has on it that would indicate Seti the First, because the temple adjacent to this construct that you just saw, because you guys need to look at this real close. There are no inscriptions on these stones. There are no hieroglyphics. There are no reliefs. There are no images. There's no writing in here at all, which is very similar to the interiors of the Great Pyramids of Giza.
The only writing that is present, there's I think 2 or 3 quote unquote flowers of life that are drawn, but they're painted at the upper buttress of one of those little cutouts.
Right.
And it's believed that was added during the Greek occupation.
Right. Yes.
So it's like anything that's there was added later.
So. And it doesn't look anything like the ruins of the rest of Seti's temple that is adjacent to it. That if you look at it, you go, all the architecture of this other part of the temple is totally different in style, clearly built later, like clearly built during Seti's reign. So Hancock's theory and that of others is that this was something where the Egyptians knew this site was important. Seti wanted to restore it, and then to commemorate that restoration, he built a temple adjacent to it as an add-on. Kind of like a. It's kind of like when you see like a cathedral that's restored in Europe, and then after they restore the cathedral and do archaeological excavations, they build a museum off to the side of the newly restored cathedral to showcase the stuff they found.
And then a gift shop, because merchandising.
Yes, this is an Egyptian gift shop called.
Yeah, the fun thing, there's I'm sure I may be getting ahead of you, but there's a large birthing, I guess, for lack of a better word, that's called like Osiris's tomb or something, and there's like one small entrance in and out. So if you look at the roof of it, it's built like a large sarcophagus, and it has Osiris crap all over the top of it and all that. So it's like,
is this here in the Osireion? Okay.
So it's one of those like, was that added later? Why was this part built? Because there was a reference to God, what are they called? The holes. They're next to the pyramids, but there's like these big holes where they would put boats down to bury the boats.
Right.
So it's believed that this may have housed the dead body of Osiris at one point. And I'm like, that's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah, because
given the age.
Yes. Because Osiris's the legend of Osiris's tomb is that it is his body was submerged in water. Is that right? Surrounded by water, or maybe he's surrounded by water or something like that. Yeah. Which,
I mean, seeing the Nile flooding into there during the wet season, kind of connects. But it's kind of, I guess, interesting. Like, it's still like the how did they build it, and the why this, why would they go through so much effort to make that And people that the SETI thing, they're like, oh, the cartouche it has SETI made this kind of thing, but it's like that's your one connection where all the because it's granite, heavy granite, some sandstone, is very indicative of when the Sphinx was built, and the Egyptians basically said this was here when we got here, kind of thing. So for people that have a hard time, well, how can you tell? If you go into a restaurant or a fast food joint, and you're like, this used to be a McDonald's. Everything McDonald's from the 90s had a very distinct kind of roof to it. And you look at the floor tiles, this used to be a McDonald's. That's the same thing.
Yeah.
So when an Egyptologist or someone who does that walks in there, this looks really similar to that.
Yep.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, because because all of the other buildings from Seti the First time and other buildings within his dynastic period, they are all similar. Whereas this particular building, which is attributed to him, is completely unlike anything, and yet it has similarities to the Sphinx enclosure, the Great Pyramids at Giza, the Giza Plateau. It says here in Hancock's book, Fingerprints of the Gods, it says, describing himself as overawed by the grandeur and stern simplicity of the monument central hall with its remarkable granite monoliths, and by the power of those ancients who could bring from a distance and move such gigantic blocks. Professor Navel, he's quoting, made a suggestion concerning the function the Osireion might have originally been intended to serve. Evidently, this huge construction was a large reservoir where water was stored during the High Nile. It is curious that what we may consider as a beginning in architecture is neither a temple nor a tomb, but a gigantic pool, a waterwork. Curious indeed, and well worth investigating further, something Navel hoped to do in the following season. I was trying to find some information here about the size of the blocks. It says right. Oh, here it goes. The moat was contained by an immense rectangular enclosure wall, surrounded on all four sides by a water-filled moat about 10 feet wide. The walls were no less than 20 feet thick, made of very large blocks of red sandstone disposed in polygonal jigsaw puzzle patterns. Into the huge thickness of this wall were set the 17 cells mentioned in Navel's report: 6 to the east, 6 to the west, 2 to the south, 3 to the north. It is a massive construct with, I mean, we're talking, I think I almost had it here. Here's one description of some of the sizes of the blocks. I passed under the hulking lintel slabs of the great gateway Navel and Strabo had described, and crossed a narrow wooden footbridge, again modern, which brought me to a large sandstone plinth, measuring 80 feet in length by 40 feet in width. This plinth was composed of enormous paving blocks and was entirely surrounded by water. 80 feet in length and 40 feet in width. I mean, we don't even have a crane that could move that today.
No, you'd have to put it on the crawler that moves the space shuttles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And even then, I know that there's been a lot of talk in the past about, Osiris and Zep Tepi the first time, and whether or not Osiris, for which the Osireion gets its name, was the first pharaoh of Egypt. Was he actually a real person? And in many ways, what I find interesting is, in our modern and postmodern world, we look for evidence, like we were talking about earlier, for the existence of the people in our own religions today. So we want physical evidence to suggest that Jesus and Muhammad and Moses and David and Abraham and all these people walk the earth. Buddha, like we want evidence that these people were all here at some point, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly, I would think that reflex could pass very easily to the myths of the past, where it's like, okay, maybe these people were very important intellectuals or leaders of their day, who then over time the context started to get lost, but the story being told. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And yet there's this demarcation line where they go, these are stories and have no merit, but these are things where we can trace back some history to. Now, there are some people. Sorry, go ahead.
There another, I guess, quasi same ballpark person, because I've got Vikings on the brain. Ragnar Lothbrok. We don't know for sure he ever existed.
Right.
All we have is that we have like 4 or 5 dudes that all said, "Yeah, that was my dad." Otherwise, it's all conjecture. So, but he's accepted to have existed because these people claim that he was. I could claim whoever's my dad. Mm-hmm. Like, if I was a Viking and I wanted respect and all that, and wanted people to think, I'd be like, yeah, my dad was Ragnar Lothbrok. So it's one of those things where it's like, why is that accepted, but things like that aren't. Like,
right.
To touch on Atlantis briefly, because I was hinting at it in the previous episode and I didn't say it out loud, was I don't believe the Atlantis myth, as Plato says it, 100%. I believe a lot of it is embellished, but it's based in truth. Much like I believe the pantheons of these gods from ancient civilizations are based in truth somehow.
Right.
Whether they be like, like Paul Bunyan or Babe in the Blue Ox, like
right.
some part of it is true on a base level, and it's just been added to as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe people like Ra, Sekhmet, Anubis, all of them were real people at some point in history, but they've been, kind of like Life of Brian kind of deal. Like, oh, I'm just Brian.
Well, isn't that the tragedy of the Turin Papyrus, where they had this amazing document of that went back into antiquity, and it was a record of all the pharaohs, and it was a record of how long each one's reign was, and it was all chronological. And they found it in one location, and they were asked to send it to the museum for preservation. And whoever was tasked with doing this back whenever, I don't remember if it was the 19th century or whenever, the idiots just put it in a box without any padding and then just put it in the mail. And when it got to the museum, it was literally crumbs. Like, it was just destroyed. And so
they put it in the mail.
Right. So they were only able to carefully and meticulously reconstruct barely half of it. And but the half that they were able to reconstruct showed the tragedy of losing the other half, because the information was so detailed about who all the pharaohs were in order, and it tracks with other I don't remember what the sources were, but they're Egyptian sources from antiquity, hinting that or claiming that some of these gods like Ra and Horus and all of them are listed as pharaohs at some point in antiquity. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that somebody like Osiris, in their mythology, could have been the first pharaoh of Egypt. Like, he's not necessarily a god. He's
just a dude that's been added to and glorified over the years.
The fish keeps getting bigger, a little bigger with every retelling. It's and for anybody wanting some additional context, Osiris was this leader of great intelligence who, helped his people, become, agricultural masters that could
brought civilization to them.
Right. He kind of showed them, how to take advantage of the Nile Delta and the rainy season and all that kind of stuff, and showed them, better ways to build structures and everything like that. And then, according to the legend, he then left, and Isis stayed behind to watch over the people, and he left and went to spread this knowledge to other places, which is weird because a lot of other ancient civilizations have the same story.
Yep. Quetzalcoatl was he showed up on our boat, gave them civilization, and then left on a boat. Coincidence? I think not.
And then there was Quetzalcoatl, and then there was the other guy, not Teotihuacan. That's a location, but there's another guy from I think it's South America or Central. Quetzalcoatl, one of them Central America, one of them South America. And they have the same story. And then there's even stories like that from Near Asia as well.
So speaking on the Osireion and South America, Central America, I'd have to look it up, but there's a site that has almost identical construction, like in terms of the way the stones are made. They found keystones in the Osireion, or not keystones, but keystone locks. So there was going to be something there, and very similar kind of dovetail construction, across the planet. And it's like, that's a hell of a coincidence.
It really is. How many coincidences can you stack up before it's no longer a coincidence? Wolf Council, thank you so much. Viracocha, that's the name I was looking for. It was on the top of my head. Thank you so much. King Eric the Greatest says, thank you for the super chat. He says, how would history be different if the library at Alexandria hadn't burned down?
I think people would stop putting their ketchup on steak if that was a thing.
It certainly was a massive loss. A lot of the source documents, I understand that they leaned on for map making, for writing, ancient history into their historical chronicles and things. They leaned on a lot of invaluable ancient wisdom and facts in that library. And so when it went up in flames, and then the other great loss after that, which I think we touched on in the last episode, was there was almost a kind of backup copy of some of that in South America and Central America. Unfortunately, Cortez and his thugs, when they showed up, they burned all of that material while they were looting all of those civilizations. And so we lost all that knowledge again, which
I think it's a not necessarily a cultural thing, but like how many examples do we have? Like in my kingdom will reign for 1,000 years, or whatever. It was all about being lost to time. Like if you won, you could eliminate any evidence of your rival having ever existed. So you won in the afterlife,
right?
So it's kind of like to that extent, I see why they did it, but also fuck them.
Yeah. It's a really well, I don't even know what the adjective I'm looking for is. It's irreplaceable. It's irreplaceable information. And now I'm so glad that SX brought this up. The void that's under the Sphinx's paws, that is the rumored Hall of Records. That, when I say rumored, I don't mean unsubstantiated. I mean there's been talk of a Hall of Records for centuries, going all the way back. What do you think about that Hall of Records thing, Sal?
I think that the fact that they're not checking it, to me, proves that it's there. I feel like some of these things that they refuse to look into have been looked into, and they didn't like what they found. So they're like, "Oh, like we won't look into that at all." But why not? Like, if you have nothing to lose, you're not afraid of it, then why not? Why not just let them look?
My question would be, and again, these are all just now I'm doing my thing where I'm not trying to throw a monkey wrench because I'm a skeptic. I'm clearly not, because I'm co-hosting this show with Sal. But if there was a Hall of Records that was known about back in the day before people started to be skeptical about it, what's the likelihood that a lot of those records got moved to the Library of Alexandria and then went up in flames? I mean, I don't know
my yums, Michael.
I'm just simply saying, like, because I don't know.
Yeah. Well, so even if it was, like, I shouldn't say I think it's there. I should say I think that's what it was, and if they did look into it, it's definitely not there anymore.
Yeah.
So
if there is a void under the Sphinx's paws, which they claim there is, due to seismographic research or sonar or whatever they've done, and yes, the Egyptian Antiquities Council doesn't want to explore it, which, shocker, then we'll never likely know. But do I think it's worth looking into? I think anything's worth looking into if it hasn't been explored yet. Absolutely. I can understand, though, why, if they don't have a way into that void, they wouldn't want to start chiseling big holes in the ground rock, because they don't want to disturb the monuments around it. So
that's what we need, some oil tycoon that's half off his rocker, just be like, I'll do it, and blast it with dynamite or something.
Yeah.
Someone go all in. So
I don't know how this conversation got started here, but just to address something here, the Aztecs were, formidable warriors. That's true. The thing you got to remember is that when the Europeans showed up, it put the Aztecs on the back foot, because the Europeans happened to greatly resemble, prophesized gods of the Aztecs' religious pantheon.
Mm-hmm.
So the Aztecs were kind of caught off guard, and then the Spanish quickly figured out that they had some kind of tactical advantage, even though they didn't speak the same language. By the time the Aztecs figured out that the Spanish meant them nothing but harm, the Spanish were already, they had already infiltrated. And I don't know if I'm describing this right, Sal, but yeah.
I'm trying to. I wish I knew what it was in context to, because it's like, yeah, the Aztecs were known for like human sacrifice and all that kind of stuff, but that wasn't the point of the conversation.
Right.
The point was that there's rumored to have been copied documentation of all these mysteries we're talking about right now. They got destroyed because some asshat was like, "No."
Right. And it was all religiously motivated, because it wasn't Cortez that was burning their records. He was wanting their gems and their gold and their loot.
The booty.
It was his religious entourage, because this is documented. His religious entourage of Catholic priests and monks and whatever, and bishops and stuff. They were the ones looting the scroll rooms and the archives and burning all that stuff.
They hit him with the God wills it.
Yeah. Well, we are at the hour. Do we want to keep going for a little bit, or do we want, since this is a smaller thing, do we want to do? What's on your mind on this topic, Sal? I feel like I haven't tapped your brain.
There was one thing that kept kind of just ruminating in the back of my mind. Is something people were talking about, the Library of Alexandria and all that. When I look at the Rosetta Stone, I'm like, that's not a whole stone.
Right.
So I'm curious, where's the rest of it?
Right.
Like, you look at it, and it's like kind of jilted, and it's obviously got a chunk missing. So was that part of a larger thing? How many other languages are lost to antiquity? Like, because I was talking to Khalil during the Iconicon meetup about etymology,
right?
Because it's something I find absolutely fascinating. It's why, like, we have words like reek in our language. Like, oh, that reeks. It comes from riech, which is the German for stink.
Right.
So it's like just how, if you follow the language back far enough, it's like, oh, this comes from Middle English, but before that it was Old Norse, and before that, blah 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 blah. How it all just kind of like funnels down into your current language.
Right.
Which the Romans played a big part in that. Latin was a huge thing, obviously.
Sure.
But it's just, when you go, I wonder how far back you have to go until languages are all the same, because the whole Tower of Babel and all that kind of stuff. That they made the men speak in tongues when it was torn down, so they couldn't build another one.
Right.
So I just was thinking about that, and how much the Rosetta Stone may have had languages that are lost to time.
Sure.
So,
Nero, nobody here is qualifying the quality of one group of humans versus the quality of another group of humans. I think you're kind of on the wrong track here with what we're talking about. So, like, for example, and this is just me painting a picture for you, okay? Let's say that I absolutely hated your guts. I'm not even kidding. I don't know you. I'm not making a sarcastic joke. I'm trying to create a parallel here, right? Let's say I absolutely hated your guts, all right? But you had tomes of stuff that you didn't write that were, one of a kind, that went back millennia, like just information, all right? Regardless of the fact that I think you're a crappy person, and I'm obviously a crappy person because I'm intending to off you. Regardless of that dynamic, that doesn't excuse the destruction of all the books that you happened to own that weren't yours. Right. That's a separate issue. So, like, just because I absolutely hate your guts to the point that I want to eliminate you from this earth, that has nothing to do with then turning around and going the extra mile and saying, and now I'm going to destroy all his shit.
Mm-hmm.
We're not talking about the same things here. I don't really care about whether or not the Aztecs were good people or bad people versus the Spanish being good people or bad people. I'm talking about what happened to this information. That's all I'm concerned with.
Mm-hmm.
What are we agreeing and disagreeing about?
Oh, Lord.
Oh, my God, Nero. You're driving me crazy.
You can go play your fiddle, dude.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm sorry. Please continue, Sal.
No, it was just thinking about, but I think what is it, Sumerian? I think is or cuneiform, I should say, which the Sumerians use is like considered the oldest language on the planet, or at least the oldest written language. Which I think the hieroglyphs or cave paintings would beg to differ, because what do they say? A picture's worth 1,000 words. So I'm being a bit anachronistic with that saying, obviously, but
Sure.
we take the cave paintings for what they are. It's like, okay, this is a hunting picture. It's like, how do we know that wasn't like instructions, like to some varying degree? Because like you see the one bison or buffalo, whatever the animal may be, surrounded by hunters. Like clearly, this may be instructions like you can't kill this by yourself. You need this many people to do it.
Right.
But I admittedly don't do much research into that, so that could be an ongoing theory that I'm not aware of. But I don't know. Language is a fun thing, I think, especially when it like words evolve all the time. I'm kind of setting up the T-ball stand for an Atlantis thing, so just bear with me.
Right.
But I find language to be interesting because things change so dramatically over time, and words become so antiquated. There is a band called the Pogues. They're like a Irish punk band, I think, from like the 90s or the 80s, something like that. Pogues, and they're from Ireland, where Pogue in Ireland means like kiss. It means to kiss somebody. Pogue in the US was a very derogatory term for a gay man, which may be why they didn't pick up steam in the US. So it's just funny how like not only is that word so antiquated, like I had to look it up. I was like, what is that? Like I was like, where is it? It's so antiquated. Like even when the band was in vogue, that term was antiquated.
Right.
So thinking about, I work with a lot of younger generation guys, and they're always throwing new slang at me and all that, and I'm setting up to go back and just think like how I always wonder how far back in time can you travel before you can't speak the language anymore.
Right.
And not very far.
No.
If we went back to like the 30s, we'd stick out like a sore thumb just based on how we talk, syntax, diphthongs, things like that.
Oh, I'm ready to go back to the 30s. I'll hop in the DeLorean and go back, and I'll just walk around being like hot crackers, and I'll just and everyone will understand. No, I'm kidding. No, you're right.
So people are like, oh, I'd go back to medieval times. It's like, good luck speaking like Middle English and Old English. Like it doesn't even sound like English.
No.
But I bring that up because of the whole Atlantis thing. They always say the island of Atlantis, this island, that island. When I forget the Greek word that was used, but that Greek word has like 4 different meanings. It can mean peninsula. It can mean an island in the middle of a river. It can mean any number of things, just like Latin is all about context. So just kind of curious about, or just thinking about the records that we do have and how much that's been mistranslated.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because we keep, in many ways, once a certain generation of scholars dies off, that link to that earlier evolution of our language is really lost. So we lose the contextual group of intellectuals that could have helped us parse it. And so now we're so far removed that, scholars have to debate basic words in sentences, from these illuminated manuscripts and, engravings and everything like that. And you just go, I can't be sure what that rune says, but we have 4 theories, or something like that.
It could mean this, it could mean that. And it's based on technology of the time.
Right.
If you ask someone for a pen in post NASA, you're going to get like a click pen or something. But if you ask for a pen in 1860, you're going to have a feather.
Right.
So
All right, so I'm going to try one more time. I'm referring to the knowledge. When Sal and I are talking about the knowledge that could have been in both the Library of Alexandria and in Central America, we're referring to the knowledge of how to build megalithic structures, the knowledge and where that came from, and what those earliest myths, stories, and legends for each civilization were concretely, including, as we talked about in the Egyptian portion of this, the lineage of pharaohs and what their names were and what their reign was. We're not talking about some carbon copy of the Library of Alexandria literally over it. Anyway.
Yeah. I'm curious just how large that library had to have been. Because I don't know if anyone's, even a book from, I don't know, like the Inquisition time were massive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's a book I'm really interested in called the Giga Codex, which is, it's this whole thing like, oh, this monk wrote it an entire night, yada yada yada, but it weighs like 300 pounds. It's a huge book, and I'm just curious, like how big, if it was a bound book versus a scroll, how big that might have been in Alexandria, or did they have cuneiform tablets, or how much of it was done in stone? Like it's. Just things that I wish had survived.
Yeah, it's I think about that a lot, the whole idea of if you could time travel back to one point and just change one thing. And I always get stopped by, I wouldn't speak their language. They'd probably, even if they knew I meant no harm, they wouldn't know what I was saying. Like even if they didn't kill me outright because I'm wearing a life preserver or whatever, or, they don't recognize my clothes or whatever, they would still not know how to receive the information. So the closest we could get would be to go back to the 1920s, where we would still be speaking English enough that, they would be like, oh, you have some weird words in your sentences, but you're an okay guy, whatever. And we could at least warn them of impending war with Germany or whatever like that. Like we could warn them of certain things. We could warn them about Pearl Harbor. You got to change your ways here and there. But that's as far back as you can really go before things start, getting kind of crazy. I could, assuming time travel was real, I could go back to, the Aztecs and just be waving my hands up and down and be like, hey, when these guys show up on the coastline, they're going to be dressed in metal and everything, and don't trust them. Like, and they wouldn't know what I was saying. And then they probably sacrifice me to, whatever.
And there's even beyond just even words, there's societal norms. Like men used to stand up if a woman was leaving the room.
Right.
You look around at like photos from the 1930s, 40s, like everyone's wearing a suit. So a grown adult didn't wear shorts if they could avoid it. Like there was a bunch of societal norms. So you wouldn't even have to open your mouth in most cases. You would just look different.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yes, they were scrolls. That's why the only things we have left are a very rare, a very small amount of scroll fragments from other repositories, and then we have stone. We have the pyramid texts, and we have stone carvings and reliefs from other locations.
My question was like, was it all made of stone? Because clearly it wasn't. It was like, how much of what is there? Yeah. If it's a library, like a global library, like you're gonna have different things. So, and it's like if there was stone tablets, they're God knows where. Like it wasn't like the library burnt down. Like, well, I guess we just leave it all here.
Right.
Like,
Lio Convoy is referring to something called the Codex.
It is. The Giga Codex is still around.
Okay.
Yeah, it's where is it? It's somewhere. It's this gigantic. It's technically a Bible with a bunch of appendices, and it has like a hand painted picture of the devil in it and all that kind of stuff. Like it's this whole woo woo kind of thing, but it's interesting.
Right. Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to think that if but for one accident or human tragedy or whatever, something, or but for one moment of idiocy every few hundred years, what could have survived down the centuries. And part of that, I think, for me, is I obsess over that stuff because I recognize I have a collector mentality. So I'm always thinking about preservation and all that kind of stuff.
It belongs in a museum.
Yeah, right. At the same time, it's also that quest for answers. Like I hate having those thoughts where I lay awake at night and I think, what was before the universe? And then your mind kind of goes mad for a minute, and then your mind like kicks you back because it's like, don't go there. You're going to go crazy. Don't think about that.
So it's like we have no concept of death or the afterlife because we have no concept of pre-birth.
Right. Right.
So.
Scott Hughes says, I am afraid that I wouldn't change anything because as horrible as things are today, at least we know we have survived to a functioning race. As soon as you change something, nothing is certain. Well, I mean,
so I'm of the firm belief that going back in time doesn't change anything, that you can't change anything, because then you create a paradox. So if you go back in time to change one thing, like let's say you go back and, I don't know, stop your dog from getting hit by a car when you're 5 years old.
Right.
In the present day, now you no longer go back in time to stop that from happening, which makes it happen. So you either create two divergent timelines or you create a loop where you get stuck. So I'm the firm belief that if you go back in time to change something, whatever life you're in right now, it's because you've already done it.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah.
Not to go off on that tangent.
Well, this whole series is going to be going off on tangents. This right here is like relaxing intellectual exercises with Sal and Michael. Like this is free-flowing conversation that starts from some specific topics and then we just kind of go wherever. And Jesse says, Michael, when it comes to language of the ancient world, I've always wondered if they would have had broken mixed languages like today, Tex-Mex or Spanish English. I know that there was more migration and interaction than a lot of the history books gave humanity credit for. So I would think there would be on some level.
There'd have to be, or God, what were they called? It was the race of sea people or something.
Yeah.
And it's just like, or the kingdom of the sea people, which no one seems to know where they came from or who they were, but it was like just this amalgamation of a bunch of different kingdoms that come together, but were the seafaring people.
Right.
And it was in reference to something, like Egypt, possibly.
Right.
So it's like, where did they come from? What did they speak? And it's I think of like Squanto, like when the settlers came to America. It's like there's always got to be that one person who learned the language first.
Yep.
To translate for everybody else. So I'm just curious, like, if, again, going back to the language thing, at some point the languages had to be so similar, at least verbally spoken, that you could, like, okay, like the languages are obviously different, but like Hindi and Nepali are very similar. They're not identical, or like Portuguese and Spanish are very similar. So I'm curious, going back far enough, it's like, how did the Greeks talk to these people or those people, which I'm sure a lot of it has to come down with who's in charge, like what, and like who owns us today, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But at that same time, it's like, it's hard to learn a new language overnight. So, it's like if we got conquered, I'm putting myself in, I don't know, antiquity, like Italy or something. If I got conquered by whoever, the Greeks, it's like, oh, now I have to learn Greek. Yeah. I'll just learn that overnight. Like, so I'm wondering how similar the languages were in the first place.
Well, which then begs the question about the whole antediluvian theory, which is if survivors from that tragedy ended up, in various places and then had to reestablish a human connection with indigenous people, right? They also didn't speak those languages necessarily. So they would have to be like demonstrating in certain ways how to do things, and then learn the local language at the same time. And so that whole idea of Osiris then going off and trying to find other people to help them get back on their feet and all that kind of stuff.
It's also just kind of spitballing off that whoever creates the word is the word, if that makes sense. Kind of like, I don't know, if you asked like a Celt, what an elephant, and they don't have a word for elephant. They've never seen one. So elephant is like a good example is anything created in the 21st century. Whoever creates it, that's what it's called.
Right.
Kind of like we borrow Schadenfreude from the Germans because we don't have a word for that. That's the word we have for it.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, like, let's say, I don't know, you're a seafaring people and you end up in the Alps and you meet some village. They have no concept of boats or something.
Right.
So it's like all their words for that are now, like, your words are now their words for that.
Right.
So I don't know. I just think all that's kind of fun just to watch how it would evolve and trickle.
So. King Eric the Greatest says, the Arab guy in the 13th Warrior learned Norse in one night. It can be done.
This is true.
I say one thing about that. As unrealistic as that was, they did do a montage. So the idea is that he learned it over many weeks and possibly months of them, walking north to Scandinavia from Southern Europe.
Actually, that was Eben was played by Antonio Banderas. He's not Arab. Worst comment ever.
Can anyone tell me the first two words that he speaks in their language that shocks them into realizing he can speak their language?
I know it's a your mom joke or your dad, I think.
Yeah, he says my mother.
Yeah, my mother. That's what.
Yeah, and then they're like, "What?" And then he keeps talking there at the campfire, and then they're like, "How'd you learn our language?" And he's like, "I listened." Which is a cool moment.
Yeah, I really liked that when he was speaking with other, Arabs, that it was in English, but when they spoke, it was a different language, and how it just kind of like cut back and forth.
Yeah.
And there's I think it actually might be Vikings. There's another show I was watching where when they're conversing with each other, they have a different accent. But when they're talking with someone else, they have like a British accent or something to infer. While it's all in English, you can understand it, to infer different languages that are being spoken.
Right.
And I can't remember what, I think it's Vikings, unfortunately, but I thought that was a really cool concept.
He says this language is easy to learn. I know he says he listened, and I don't remember him saying that. I haven't seen the movie in a long time, but I do remember the first words he says were my mother. Yeah, my mother was a pure woman. Yeah. Which it's amazing that he figured out how to put together a sentence with words like pure and everything like that. It's a movie. What do you want?
Right. It's a fun movie. It's a fun retelling of Beowulf.
Yes. Seem to be a lot of people enjoying retelling things like Beowulf and well, okay. Now that we're this whole series is based in mythologies and things like that and legends. What's a better Beowulf story or movie, The 13th Warrior or the all digital CGI Beowulf?
13th Warrior, hands down.
Yeah.
No comparison. 13th Warrior is like loosely based, like extremely loosely based on like a real person.
Right.
The CGI one is barely even based on Beowulf.
Right.
So.
Yeah, that film was some reason I ended up with that film on HD DVD.
Ooh.
I don't know why. I think it was given to me or something. But wow, like I watched it once. I have no interest in ever revisiting that film ever.
Nope.
I'm not sure what they were really trying to accomplish there.
I'll watch the Christopher Lambert Beowulf before I watch that one.
Oh yeah,
that one's rough. That one's real rough.
But at least it's not Uncanny Valley.
Yeah. It was actually, weirdly enough, that Beowulf came up in conversation at work a couple nights ago. One of the guys I work with, he was like 6 when it came out. And he was like, I thought they were real people. I was like, I was in college and the CGI was dated then.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. It's also really disturbing because the way they position that whole thing in that version of Beowulf, the CGI version, it looks like all of these people are tormenting and abusing this animal that can't get away from them, and like is already wounded and deformed and everything like that. And so you're not really sympathetic toward the protagonists.
Right.
So you're kind of like, what's the point of this exercise? And I've noticed that has been a problem with a lot of filmmakers these days. And I know we're going into a film discussion, but in some ways it relates, which is that they're so afraid to write characters that are diametrically opposed that they end up most of the time now making the villain more sympathetic than the hero. And then what do you do? So if we were to task Hollywood today with writing a story about Osiris or Quetzalcoatl or something like that, they would end up making those guys villains, and then and they would make Set and all those guys heroes. It's very weird.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I feel like the generation of people who are writing movies now are the people that are around my age who grew up with like Punisher, Wolverine, like all the anti-heroes being like the big names. I feel like that's like, oh my, that's got to be this. It's there's something to be said about a compelling villain. The best villains are the villains who think they're justified. But that doesn't mean that you have to convince the audience that they're justified.
Right.
Like I don't know. That Thanos didn't do anything wrong, obviously. But no, it's a weird thing. Like I don't understand it. Like Grendel. So Grendel is the son of the illegitimate son of the king, and I think she's a witch,
right,
or sorceress. And so it's like, okay, like he, the king messed up and brought this thing into the world and locked it in a dungeon and all that. And now it's killing his men at night. It's like, okay, so it's like, okay, the king messed up, but Beowulf is still the hero, and Grendel is still a monster killing people.
Right.
So it's like, oh well, he was wronged his whole life. It's like, yeah, a lot of us have childhood trauma. We don't go out and just murder random people.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know.
Yeah, Beowulf versus Grendel was supposed to just be this knight slaying the dragon early version of that kind of story, and yet all the nuance they piled onto it to try and make it this other thing. It really that's why I think you're right that the 13th Warrior kept it a little more boiled down and authentic.
Yeah, Beowulf and his friends, and they're like, "Oh, this king needs your help," and he's like, "Okay, yeah, I'll go do it," and then he dies. But spoiler alert for a movie that's been out for like 25 years. But yeah, 13th Warrior. I didn't like it when I saw it as a kid because I didn't understand it. It didn't hold my interest. When I saw that, I wanted everything to be mystical. I wanted there to be an actual fight for him, and then I was like, "Oh, it's just people with torches. This is stupid."
Right.
But as an adult watching, I'm like, this is pretty damn good.
I remember seeing the trailer for it when it was still called Eaters of the Dead. And then suddenly the movie didn't come out for another year. And I went, is this like Captain America in 1990 where we saw a trailer and then nothing? And then suddenly the trailers were back in theaters a year later for it coming out 8 months from then. And it was called The 13th Warrior. And it was just like, what? Which I thought was pretty interesting. And I've heard that there were major reshoots on that movie as well. I also feel like, based on the number, because I've seen it more than a few times, I feel like that movie was shot. I told this to my brother at the time. My brother was such a huge fan of it. He actually had a poster, a 27 by 40 original movie poster of it, professionally matted and framed. Like, he loved that movie. But I told him at the time, I said, 13th Warrior is a movie that was shot big and then edited small. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like the movie was shot on a huge scope.
Right.
And it felt like it was wanting to be this really big,
like epic or something.
And then all of a sudden they edited it so that it felt more like a very focused character piece. And so So there's a clash of editing versus composition, and there's this kind of, and then of course there's some obvious reshoots going on where they redub some lines because they felt like they had to give them a more tactile nemesis. So they were like, oh, and remember the dude with the antlers, you got to kill him too.
Right.
And that's the dubbed in part. And so you're like, oh, okay, well.
Yeah, a lot of ADR in that movie.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was weird that we're off on a tangent, but I thought it was weird that, like, obviously the queen that poisons him, like, that's the one controlling everything. So you think that would be it, but they're like, oh, it's this guy with the antlers that has no name.
Right. Yeah.
You know, because dude bro's got to fight.
I thought since we're at the 90-minute mark, I found a little passage here about the Osireion, and I thought we could kind of reflect on that as part of our final little bit. It says here, the Osireion's similarity to the Valley Temple at Giza it showed it to be of the same epoch when building was made with enormous stones. Likewise, until the end of her life, Margaret Murray remained convinced that the Osireion was not a cenotaph at all, least of all Seti's. She said, quote, "It was made for the celebration of the mysteries of Osiris, and so far is unique among all the surviving buildings of Egypt. It is clearly early, for the great blocks of which it is built are of the style of the Old Kingdom. The simplicity of the actual building also points to it being of that early date. The decoration was added by Seti I, who in that way laid claim to the building. But seeing how often a pharaoh claimed the work of his predecessors by putting his name on it, this fact does not carry much weight. It is the style of the building, the type of the masonry, the tooling of the stone, and not the name of the king, which date a building in Egypt." So,
words to live by.
Words to live by. Trust what your eyes see. Trust what you can see. So,
indeed.
Well, what are we going to do next? What's our next foray? Do we have an idea?
We're going to take over the world.
Excellent.
Yeah. You know, we'll be a firm but fair. I don't know. Let's see. What our next one is going to be a heavy hitter, I do believe. So,
we could jump to we could jump to something like Cambodia. We could talk about the temple complexes there, or we could talk about
the temple complexes that were a myth until they were found.
Yeah. KBA says King Arthur. We could talk about King Arthur.
Yeah, or Uther Pendragon.
Uther.
Yeah.
Angkor Wat. That's kind of what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking, the Cambodia complexes. But either way, we can discuss it behind the scenes and come up with something. All right. Well, everybody, enjoy your Sunday night. Enjoy your the rest of your weekend or the beginning of your Monday. Sal and I will see you on the next episode of this informal, casual Ancient Mysteries discussion series. And we'll announce that topic soon. So, Sal, I'll give you the last thought of the night.
Huzzah!
Excellent. All right, everyone. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.